Hello, this is Dr. Missick, and in one of my previous videos I recently uploaded, I was talking about how that Saudi Arabia has been financing these School of Islamic Studies in Yale and Princeton and Harvard and Oxford, spending probably hundreds of millions of dollars to encourage the study of Islam in Western academia. And as a result, we have these scholars that are coming out of this, such as Yasir Qadhi, who are now talking about holes in the narrative, holes in the Islamic narrative, which are causing Muslims to lose faith and are actually crumbling the very foundations of Islam. So Yasir Qadhi, we're going to watch his video explanation of this. He discusses things that shook his faith when he's studying, when Islam is subjected to historical, archaeological, and scientific scrutiny. All of a sudden we see these holes in the narrative when you study Islam in an academic setting. And this caused a crisis of faith for Yasir Qadhi, and he's been vocal about this recently, and this has actually shook the entire Islamic world. So what I'm going to do in this short video is talk about briefly what these holes in the narrative, the traditional Islamic narrative that Yasir Qadhi is talking about, that caused him to question his faith and are causing thousands or perhaps eventually millions of Muslims to leave the Islamic religion. So first off, let's look at what Yasir Qadhi had to say.
Now, as for the issue itself, every single student of knowledge knows, who studies Ulum al-Quran, that the most difficult topics are ahruf and qira'at, and the concept of ahruf and the reality of ahruf, and the relationship of the Uthmanic Mus'haf with the ahruf, and the preservation of the ahruf. Is it 1, is it 3, is it 7, and the relationship of the qira'at to the ahruf. This is a topic that when you're the beginning student of knowledge, you're like, what is all of this going on here? When you go a little bit more, you learn to simply memorize what your teachers say and regurgitate it out, and you don't fully comprehend. When you do a deep dive is when things get very, very awkward and difficult. And this isn't new. This is from the time of the Sahaba. And this is not a joke, brothers and sisters. The issue of ahruf and qira'at caused confusion to somebody whom the Prophet ﷺ said, if you want to listen to the Quran directly, listen to Ubay. I mentioned the crises that happened to me at Yale, my first year at Yale. It wasn't a crisis of faith, by the way, so it's very clear about this. People misinterpret it. It was a crisis of my understanding of knowledge. It was a crisis of what my teachers taught me. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, as somebody who memorized the Quran as a teenager, alhamdulillah, in my entire life, I have never doubted that the Quran is divine. You cannot doubt that. And you listen to it, you recite it, you just cannot doubt that. It's never been an issue. This was the issue. That the issue of ahruf and preservation and qira'at and relationships between them, these are very, very difficult issues. And the most advanced of our scholars, they're not quite fully certain how to solve all of the unanswered questions in there. These issues should only be discussed amongst people who know what the qira'at are and who understand some of these questions that are being raised. Traditional understandings of ahruf and qira'at cannot answer some of these pressing questions that are now being poked by our people outside of, by our academics, by their academics outside of the faith tradition. You see, in a Muslim environment, there's always some respect that we have for the Quran. We should. In a Muslim environment, we'll press a little bit and then we'll say, okay, khalas, sami'na wa ata'na. And that's great, alhamdulillah. When you go to academia, they don't have that red line. And they're going to just, you know, the famous story of the emperor with no clothes. They're going to just point out, no, that doesn't make any sense. Well, that's not true, and this and that. And they'll bring issues, which I'm not going to mention explicitly, that you know are true because they're in your own books. They're not inventing anything new. And it's very clear to you and to every single very advanced student and specialist that the standard narrative has holes in it. That's what I'm going to say. The standard narrative does not answer some very pressing questions. You know, these are now well known within the Western Academy, that they're bringing forth issues. Their level of now knowledge is leaps and bounds above what it used to be, 100 years ago, And by and large, our ulama in the Eastern world are not aware, by and large, of what's going on in the Western side of things. And they're not answering those questions in a manner that it needs to be answered. And this is something all of us that are in academia fully acknowledge. We actually issues of the relationship, of the origins, of the ikhtilaf and all of this should only be discussed amongst those who are familiar with this science. It takes a while. I can't answer this question in a 20-minute interview, nor is it wise to do so, which is why I never brought this topic up myself. You will not find one lecture of mine about this issue. It should never be brought up in public. And I don't like these idiots, and they are idiots, wallahi. This is not something you discuss amongst the masses, ya akhi. It's not wise. You don't understand qira'at, let it be. It's wise. That's why I never did it. It's the Western academics. These problems are now becoming mainstream. Twitter has so many accounts of Quran experts, and they're non-Muslims, and they're just saying things.
Let me ask you one question to try and make this as specific as possible. I think if I were to give you a blank mushaf, and tell you to write what is munazzal verbatim from Allah into that mushaf with no human interference, would you write something which corresponds?
It's not an easy answer. It's not an easy yes or no. It is enough for the Muslim to believe that the
I think
Quran
this should be an easy yes or no, though. Yasir Qadhi. I have to.
Okay, very, very well. So, Ya Muhammad, after we get off this phone call, me and you, let's have a number of discussions. No problem. I'm very open with advanced students. But these issues should not... Look, it is Kalamullah, what is going to be written. It is Kalamullah. It is
what would you write?
Let's not... You're pushing me. And I'm saying it's not hikmah to... Listen, I have a condition. Like I said, everything I say is going to be factual.
All right, we're going to look at two big holes. And the first hole is there's no historical evidence for the existence of Islam, surprisingly enough, until almost the year 700. So Muhammad supposedly died in the year 632. In Islam, there's no evidence from the early Islamic leaders, supposedly. And it makes us question that perhaps the earliest, this wasn't a Muslim empire. Perhaps Islam as we know it developed over the decades, or perhaps even over centuries, as it was crafted by these Arab leaders to suit their needs, especially by Caliph Maliki, who ruled from 685 to 705. So let's look at what Tom Holland is a British historian, and he made this discovery. And there's a documentary he produced where he discusses this issue about the origins, the mystery, the origins of Islam.
My name's Tom Holland. I'm a historian. I write about ancient empires, so Persian, Greek, Roman empires. And now I want to write about the most influential of all the ancient empires, the empire founded by the Arabs in the 7th century, the empire that gave us Islam. I thought that it would be a relatively simple matter. It's been said that Islam was born in the full light of history. But when I began on the project, I discovered that that wasn't actually the case at all. When it comes to Islam's beginnings, there is no full light of history, only a kind of darkness. And when you start looking, everything seems up for grabs.
So basically what happened is Tom Holland is a historian, and he's written on great empires in the past, Sparta and other Greek civilizations, on Rome, and he wanted to turn his hand towards the study of early Islam. So he wanted to look at contemporaneous evidence for Islam. And there isn't any. Shockingly enough, there is none until the first time we see Islam as we know it today is in a coin minted by Caliph al-Maliki in the year 695. And interestingly enough, he has a coin he minted in the year 695, looks like a very pagan coin, where he has an image of himself. And supposedly Muslims don't believe in images. So this caliph, it looks like a pagan coin where he has an image of himself minted on the coin. And then a couple of years later, we have the Shahada in Arabic on the coin. Some people say that the Apostle Paul is the real founder of Christianity. Of course, I don't believe that. But there's reasons to believe that Caliph al-Maliki is the real founder of Islam. So the interesting thing, let's go back to me as a historian. So I got a history degree. And what I learned to do as a historian is history is the study of primary sources, right? We want to get contemporary evidence. So we don't have any. In the 600s, there's nothing about Muhammad, there's nothing about Islam. People who are encountering the Arab invading armies, they don't describe them as being Muslim at all. And like I said, surprisingly enough, you have the supposed diplomatic correspondence of the caliphs. They're not mentioning Islam at all. And on earlier Islamic coins, there's not the Shahada or anything like that. They just have Bismillah Allah in the name of God. Nothing about Muhammad, nothing about Islam. That doesn't appear until later. So how does Tom Holland deal with this, where in about the first 100 years of Islamic history, or the Arab imperial history, Islam doesn't appear. And finally, in the late years, around the year 700, then we see, Islam as we know it today starting to emerge and develop. So how he dealt with this is like, okay, here's an issue. There's a book I recommend called The Death of the Prophet. And it describes how contemporary evidence states that Muhammad invaded the Holy Land and that he was alive in the year 634, when Muslim sources say he died in the year 632. So how does Tom Holland deal with that? And he says, well, what happened is the Muslims needed to craft a biography of a prophet, and they decided to use the story of Moses. They say that Muhammad is a prophet like Moses. We know that Moses wasn't able to lead the people into the promised land. He had some battles, but it was Joshua that initiated the conquest. So that's how the Muslims wanted to tell their story of Muhammad, is that he led his people to the precipice, and then Abu Bakr led them on to victory and the foundation of the Islamic Empire, or the Arab Empire that became Islamic after several decades, according to historical evidence. So Tom Holland believes that these stories were crafted over decades to serve the interest of the Islamic community, especially in creating a legal system, jurisprudence, because the Persians had an old legal system, ancient civilization, and so did the Byzantines, the Roman Empire, and the Arabs are starting from scratch. So the Arabian rulers had the stories of Muhammad and the Quran, the Hadith, and the Surah crafted to serve their needs, to create a legal system so they could administer this great empire. And one of the things they wanted was the sacred scripture in Arabic, because you had this Roman Empire, they had the Greek scriptures for these people. They wanted a uniquely Arab civilization, so they crafted a religion. So the question is, who was Muhammad? How much of the stories that the Muslims tell are true? Tom Holland also deals with one of the most scandalous stories about Muhammad, where Muhammad marries a 6-year-old girl and deflowers her when she's 9. The story from the Hadith is that Aisha was playing with little girls. She herself was a little girl. She's 9 years old. She's playing with toys in the backyard with these little girls together, and she's announced, like, the Prophet would like to see you. So she's taken to the Prophet, and he deflowers her, we'll put it that way. So we look at it today, it looks kind of shocking. And Tom Holland is saying, well, that story was crafted. It's not necessarily historically true, because Aisha is Abu Bakr's daughter, and this brings him to Abu Bakr is the first caliph that succeeded Muhammad, and that gives him legitimacy, that he just didn't marry his daughter as an adult, but as a child, to ensure her virginity, that she hadn't even had her first period, according to these sources, when she's deflowered, to show that she's a virgin, wife of Muhammad, his favorite wife, the very daughter of the first caliph, Abu Bakr. So, but does that help Islam? First off, the story is scandalous. Secondly, does that really help to say the story is not true, right? If the hadith is not true, in that instance, then what else is not true? So if they just made this story up, what else did they make up? And Tom Holland believes that quite a bit. He dismisses the historical reliability of the Quran and the Hadith, saying that it was developed over a period of time and started being assembled in the form we know it, I guess in the very, very late 600s, early 700s, to serve the purpose of the Arab rulers who at that time crafted the religion into Islam. In the book, The Death of the Prophet, it looks at the actual evidence, contemporary evidence, where the Arab conquest is described very differently by first-hand testimony by people living in that period, who don't mention or describe things that are in the Islamic sources. So that's very interesting. But that book, and there's a lot of evidence for believing this, saying that Muhammad himself wasn't really a Muslim, that he was a millennial prophet. He's predicting that the end of the world is coming very soon, and he created an Abrahamic religion. He's trying to create a religion where Jews and Christians and his followers can come together. Later on, it developed into Islam and excluded Christians and Jews. But these sources show in the Quran itself, well, there is a big focus on the Day of Judgment and last days in the Quran. You can read it yourself. So I think that the author of The Death of the Prophet is onto something. And the strong Jewish influence, it seems like marginalized people were attracted to Muhammad, the Jewish people and Gnostic Christians. And that's why what we see in the Quran is a derivative book that is derived from the Jewish Midrash and Christian apocryphal Gospels. But it could be that in the late 600, early 700s, that these scribes just borrowed from these texts to craft the Quran. What needs to happen is we need to look at the best way to discover who Muhammad really was, if he existed at all, is to do a deep dive into contemporary historical narratives that describe it. I think that's where we're going to find the truth. And then we should judge the Hadith and the Quran itself in light of what we find the first people who record Islam, or mostly non-Muslim sources, what they say about it, instead of sources that are written 100 to 200 years after the time of 632 to 634, when this prophet lived. So first off, there's just an empty space in the life of Muhammad, and contemporary evidence from the time of the early Islamic conquest contradicts the Islamic account. And when I studied history in college, that's the best sources, right? Contemporary first-hand sources, instead of trusting in something that was written over 100 to 200 years later. So that's the problem, is there's a lack of primary sources, and the primary sources we do have say something altogether different and contradicting the traditional Islamic sources that are written much later. So how did Tom Holland deal with this? He thinks that Islam was crafted and invented several decades, almost a century after the death of whoever this prophet was. And these ancient Syriac, Aramaic sources seem to indicate that there was a prophet. We don't really know a lot about him yet. We're going to have to ask these hard questions to try to see if we can reconstruct history. But a lot of his people who were following him were not following him because they necessarily believed in the religion. They were following him to rape and pillage and to enrich themselves in raiding and attacking and going on these raids. So Muhammad went up there supposedly in the area, spreading, attacking and looting and raiding, and these Arabs accompanied him, not because they believed in his religion, but because they wanted to share in the booty. And then later on, apparently decades later, these Arab rulers started to promote this religion that they crafted. Probably might not have much resemblance to what this early Arabian prophet said, to serve the purposes of the Arab Empire. So then they started to promote, they crafted and they promoted the Islamic religion. So it's a late development, and it probably doesn't represent whatever this Arabian prophet was, who we call Muhammad, whoever the historical person this religion is based on. I mean, it's just, we need to look at history, and history is contradicting what the Hadith says. So this is something that historians haven't begun to look at until recently. And I think Tom Holland's doing a good job in that. So number one, we see that for the first 100 years, there's no evidence that Islam existed. And the first evidence we have of Islam is that coin, the gold coin by Caliph al-Malaki, where you see the Shahada for the first time. It's amazing, isn't it? You'd think there'd be more historical evidence, but the evidence seems to indicate that Islam, the story of Muhammad in the Quran, was developed or crafted by decade after decade until it came to the form we have today. So the second hole in the narrative is the Quran itself. Muslims have been taught until recently that there's only one Quran, and wherever you go around the world, all Qurans are exactly the same. Even the diacritical marks, which wouldn't have been in the original Quran, are all the same wherever you go. So Hatun Tash, she's a Turkish convert to Christianity. She's gone around the Arab world. She went to religious bookstores, and she bought 30 Qurans, and every single Quran is different from the other, and they have 90,000 variations between them. They're still counting. There's probably going to be hundreds of thousands of variations. And we have Dr. Brubaker, I think his name is. He's got a site called The Variant Quran, where he's showing, we're probably going to find hundreds of thousands of variants in the Quran soon. He's putting this channel just showing that there's all kinds of, if you look at the oldest Quran manuscripts. And beyond that, we have no Quran manuscript from the 600s. We have Bibles older than that, but no Quran. And they did find, in Yemen, they found the Sanaa Quran. What happened is Caliph Uthman, supposedly, he tried to standardize the Quran. So they had that problem back then where there's all kinds of different Qurans. So he tried to create one Quran for all Muslims. And there's debate about that. Some people didn't like his version of the Quran. And they found in a storage area in the dome of a mosque one of these Qurans that survived the destruction, and of course it has significant variations in the text. And then beyond that, we have John of Damascus, one of the early church, actually one of the later of the early church fathers, and he's one of the first people who described Islam as we know it, mostly, right? Because I think Islam is still in development at the time of John of Damascus, and he lived from 676 to 749. And he's quoting from the Quran. He's describing a book called The Camel of God, a chapter in the Quran called a surah called The Camel of God. Well, the Camel of God is mentioned in the Quran, but it's not a surah anymore. So I think that John of Damascus probably had a different Quran in front of him than what we had today. So that shows that the Quran was still evolving, and the biography of Muhammad was still evolving. One of the interesting things that John of Damascus says is that the Kaaba, and I don't know if he describes it as being in Mecca, but they have the Kaaba and they have the black stone. He says the black stone is actually an idol of Khubar, the goddess Venus, the sex goddess. And Muslims at that time were saying that Abraham, he's not able to have children, so he takes Hagar, and they make love on top of a statue of Aphrodite or Venus, an Arabian sex goddess. So he takes this idol and he puts it underneath him, and he gets on it, and he has sex with Hagar. That enables him, since I guess the divine power of the sex goddess enables Abraham to impregnate Hagar. So that's what Muslims were teaching and saying. That's why the black stone was important. And John Damascus says at his time, you looked at the black stone, it was an idol. It was a carved idol, a statue of the god that they would see as the equivalent to Venus, the sex goddess. So we see the Quran and life of Muhammad evolved over the decades. So what are Muslims going to do about all this information? So what happens is they take, Saudi Arabia pays for Islam to be studied in these universities. So they use the academic methods and historical scrutiny. And then we see these giant holes, and we find that Islam evolves and it's changed by rulers in the early Arab empires that were becoming Muslim. They were developing and inventing this religion. So what do Muslims do about that? Is that any comfort? So like I mentioned before, the story of, Tom Holland saying, maybe they just made this story up about Aisha to show that Abu Bakr was the heir of Muhammad, because after all, Muhammad himself married his daughter, and she was pure as a virgin because she hadn't even had her first period. So that's Tom Holland says, that story was just invented. So like I said, if the life of Muhammad is considered, he's the perfect example for all mankind, and the hadith are, since that's true, and from Muslim point of view, the hadith, these hadith which are considered dependable and authentic, they're the basis of Islam today. A lot of Islamic practices come from the hadith. So if the hadith were just invented, what are Muslims to do? If that story is invented, how many other stories are invented? All of them? What do we know about Muhammad? Very little, apparently. So I don't know what they're going to do about that. Right now, what they do is when Hatun Tash comes to Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park in England, and they see her coming to ask these questions, they close up shop and they run away from her as fast as they can. That's the solution they have right now. I think the left has been coddling Islam for a long time, and I think these are valid questions for a historian, and we should be able to investigate them, let the pieces fall where they may. And Christians have dealt with, through biblical archaeology and textual criticism, we've dealt with these questions openly and honestly for centuries. If you look at the historical record of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, it seems to be historically reliable. But there's a lot of things we know about the historical Jesus, but what do we know about the historical Muhammad, if that even was his name? So leftists need to stop coddling Muslims, right? What's happened is Yosef Qadhi has, like Toto, he's pulled the curtain back, and now we see what the wizard really is. Not this big scary man, but a head floating in there with fire and smoke, but a doddering old man. So the curtain's been pulled back, the lie has been exposed. So where do you go from there? And I think that we need to look at the truth and find the facts. Thanks to Saudi Arabia in financing these institutes of higher education and applying historical scrutiny to Islam, now the very foundations of Islam are collapsing. And what we need to do, I think, as historians, is to look at the facts and see if we can reconstruct what really happened. And apparently it's not going to match the traditional Muslim narratives which were developed centuries later. So these are the two holes in the narrative. Number one, there's a big gaping hole where there's no evidence that Islam even existed for the first almost 100 years of the Islamic Empire. Secondly, the Quran was revised and changed again and again throughout history. And even now, there are well over 30, maybe as many as 38 different Qurans with tens of thousands of variations and alternate readings between them. So those are the facts, and they're exposing the two holes. So it's the best option? Well, to know the way, the truth, and the life, to come and place faith in Jesus Christ and escape falsehood and error and come to the truth. Because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and Jesus is the expression of the love of God.